Hello again, everyone. We need to start core 4. This core is relatively short and very straightforward, so we'll just get right on it. So it says, for topic 1, question 1, 1A, it says species. Species are groups of organisms that can potentially interbreed to produce fertile offspring. That term fertile right there will be important. The members of a species may be reproductively isolated in separate populations. All right, let's put some meaning to that because those are a bunch of words, and let's put some meaning to it. So this is core 4, and this is question 1A. So what we're addressing here is what the definition is of a species. What does it mean when an organism is a member of a species? So these are organisms that can reproduce with one another and create, here comes that word again, fertile offspring. Fertile means they have the ability to reproduce. So if you have two organisms that when they reproduce, their offspring is fertile, by definition, we call them members of the same species. So there are times when you cross two organisms and their offspring is not fertile. And the classic example is a farm animal called a mule. Now, the farmer's term is a jackass. That's where the insult comes from, because mules are the product of a horse and a donkey, and mules are mentally challenged. They are not very intelligent animals, thus farmers would call them a jackass. That's where the insult comes from. To call someone a jackass, what you are literally calling them is an infertile, mentally impaired farm animal. It's really funny when you get into the history of some of these insults, where they actually come from, right? So what's important about the mule is it makes a difference who is mom and who is dad. So you're a farmer and you have a horse. Horses are extremely useful work animals for carrying mass, equipment, materials for long distances. The issue, though, is that their legs are very thin, and so if you ask them to pull very, very heavy weights, their legs tend to break. So they're good over long distance riding, but they're not always good at pulling large weights. But then there's another animal, and if you take the male of this species, which would be the donkey, donkeys are much shorter. They're a huskier, thicker, more muscular animal. Think of it as the difference between a Doberman and a Rottweiler, right? Dobermans are tall and thin, whereas the Rottweiler there's a lot more mass, there's a lot more muscle. So donkeys are shorter and more muscular. So what farmers did is they wanted the height of the horse, but they wanted the muscular structure of a donkey. But these two organisms are different species. So you can get them to mate, you can get them to reproduce, and it produces a mule. This animal is taller than the donkey, so it takes after its mother's height, but it has the musculature of dad's mule genetics. And so, his donkey genetics. So the mule, though, is sterile, does not produce ova, does not produce sperm, and therefore is sterile and cannot reproduce. Okay? So therefore, by definition, the horse and the donkey, even though they can mate and produce offspring, the horse and the donkey are considered two separate species. Now, as a point of interest, because whenever you bring up mules and donkeys and horses, and you say that that mom has to be a horse in order to produce a mule, students always ask, what happens if you switch? What happens if you get a male horse and a female donkey? It's a good question. You produce another farm animal called a hinny or a hiney, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Okay, and this individual is also sterile. It's a useful farm animal, but not nearly as useful as the mule. So the definition of a species is two organisms that reproduce, but it has to be a fertile offspring. Now, people always assume that in order to be the same species, that it has to be in the same biome, and that just is not the case. So you might have a population that, let's say, is in Canada. Let's see if I can spell Canada. There we go. There's Canada. Okay? So you have a species in Canada. And you have a species, a similar biome might be a population in Switzerland. And you have the same species. Now, even though these two species are isolated, they are reproductively isolated by the distance between Europe and North America, right? If you could grab an individual from this population and an individual from this population, and they could produce viable, fertile offspring, they are considered the same species, okay? These organisms do not always have to exist in the same biome, okay? Except there's a footnote to this. However, when populations that are reproductively isolated populations that are reproductively isolated eventually become two different species. And this process is called speciation. This is where new species come from. And this is really important when it comes to Charles Darwin and evolution. When people start talking about the theory of evolution and they attribute it to Charles Darwin, they say Darwin's theory of evolution, that is not accurate. People were writing and publishing about evolution 100 years before Charles was even born. Charles gave us where species come from. That's why if you look up his book is called The Origin of Species. This is the name of his book, okay? This was the book written by Charles Darwin. And what Darwin did was he provided us with the explanation of where new species come from. Why, when you look at the geological record, what's in the rocks, do you see new species all the time? How is this possible? Because populations become reproductively isolated, their genetic differences accumulate until there's such a genetic difference between these two populations that they can no longer interbreed. Thus, you would have species A and species B. Okay? And so the process that causes these populations to change over time, that is natural selection. So natural selection drives evolution and causes the formation of new species. And that's what makes Darwin's work controversial, is it explains how new species are created over time, and this conflicts with some biblical stories that all species were created all at once. The story in the record of the rocks is quite different, and that the new species change and appear over time. So that's Core 4, Question 1A, and welcome to the first of many Core 4 videos. Talk to you guys soon.